They called me a disgrace. My own parents shredded my wedding invite in front of the entire family and tossed it straight into the trash like I was nothing. While they showered my golden sister with luxury vacations, designer gowns, and praise, they spat on me and my fiancé as if we were dirt beneath their shoes. I was humiliated, abandoned, and told I wasn't worth celebrating. But what they didn't know is that I was holding a secret so big it would flip their perfect little world upside down. Because while they were busy clinking champagne glasses with my sister, I was planning a wedding unlike anything they could ever dream of inside a $40 million Malibu estate, with cameras rolling and the entire nation watching. And when they saw me walk down that aisle broadcast live, their smiles vanished. Their phones lit up with regret, their hands shook, and they sent me a desperate text. "Can we come?" My answer: just 2 words. Too late. But trust me, this story isn't just about one cold reply. It's about years of favoritism, betrayal, secrets buried in wills and charities, and the shocking twists that made my parents beg for forgiveness in front of the world. Stay with me, because by the end of this story you'll see exactly how I turned their cruelty into the sweetest revenge. My name is Rebecca Collins. I am 30 years old, and I work as an event planner in Los Angeles. For most of my adult life, I have carried a quiet hope that one day my family would look at me the way they always looked at my older sister, with pride, with admiration, with that glow of unconditional love. I had built a steady career, I had friends who respected me, and I had found the man I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Yet nothing I achieved ever seemed to count in the eyes of my parents. That small, fragile hope was what made me press the edges of my wedding invitations, so carefully sealing each one by hand. The most important one, the one I clutched a little tighter, was addressed to my parents. I convinced myself that if I gave it to them personally, if they heard my voice tremble with sincerity, perhaps they would soften. My fiancé and I had been planning our future, and I wanted my family to be part of it, even though deep down I feared their reaction. I chose a Sunday evening when I knew the entire family would be gathered. My parents often held dinners at their house full of laughter and chatter, the kind of warmth that always seemed to shrink the moment I entered the room. That night was no different. When I stepped in holding the envelope against my chest, conversations quieted just enough to remind me of my place an outsider in my own family. Still, I walked toward my parents with the kind of cautious optimism that only someone desperate for acceptance can muster. "Mom, Dad," I said, placing the invitation on the table before them. "I'd like to invite you to my wedding." My voice cracked on the word wedding, but I smiled, forcing brightness into the moment. For a fleeting second, I thought my father's hand might reach for the envelope with care. Instead, he pulled it sharply toward him, tore it straight down the middle, then again and again until the pieces scattered across the polished wood like fallen leaves. The room gasped, but not in my defense. My mother leaned back in her chair, her eyes cold, her mouth twisting into that familiar look of disapproval. "A disgrace," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence. "You marrying him is nothing but shame for this family." Laughter rippled quietly from the corner where my cousins sat. My golden sister smirked, sipping her wine, the diamonds on her wrist catching the light. I felt the burn of humiliation climb from my chest to my cheeks. They had not only rejected me, they had done it publicly with the kind of cruelty that left no room for misunderstanding. I tried to speak to defend myself, to tell them that love was not something to be mocked. But my throat closed, and all I could do was gather the shredded remains of what was supposed to be a symbol of unity. My fingers trembled as I held the scraps, each piece a reminder of how little value I held in their eyes. The memories rushed back in fragments. My 8th birthday, when I blew out the candles only to hear my mother scold me for not smiling as beautifully as your sister. The high school graduation, where my parents left halfway through my speech because my sister had a dance recital across town. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every milestone, I was always the afterthought, the shadow standing behind the golden child. That night at the dinner table, the weight of all those years collapsed on me. My father pushed his plate away as if the conversation was finished. My mother waved her hand, dismissing me as though I were a stranger, not her daughter. I wanted to scream to demand that they see me, that they at least pretend to care. Instead, I swallowed the words like bitter medicine. With my eyes blurred by tears, I turned and walked out of the house. Each step felt heavier, as though I was dragging decades of rejection behind me. I reached the door and paused, hoping, praying that one of them would call after me. That anyone would say, "Rebecca, wait." But the only sound was the clinking of glasses and the low hum of conversation resuming as if I had never been there at all. Outside, the cool air hit my face, mingling with the hot sting of tears. I clutched the broken invitation to my chest, knowing it symbolized more than just one night. It was my entire life with them dismissed, torn apart, and discarded. For a moment, I wondered if maybe they were right, if maybe I was a disgrace. But as I walked to my car, a different thought began to stir. Maybe this wasn't the end of my story with them. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something far greater. Because while my parents saw only shame, I knew deep down there was more to my journey than the pieces of paper lying on that dinner table floor. And though I couldn't see it clearly, then that night of humiliation would one day become the very foundation of the sweetest revenge they never saw coming. The night I left my parents' house with my shredded wedding invitation still haunted me in the days that followed. I carried the sting of their rejection like a fresh wound, but what deepened that pain was the reminder of just how differently they treated my sister. Only a week later, while I was still piecing together my composure, I opened my phone to see a flood of photographs that made the contrast between us painfully clear. My parents had thrown a lavish birthday party for my sister Allison. The images on social media looked like something out of a magazine spread. The backyard was draped in strings of twinkling lights, the tables set with crystal and silver, the guests dressed in elegant gowns and tuxedos. A champagne tower glittered at the center, and Allison stood before it in a designer dress that hugged her like it had been made for royalty. My parents had captioned the photos with words that cut me far deeper than the act of tearing up my invitation. "Our pride and joy," my mother had written. "The daughter who makes us proud every single day." My father chimed in with a separate post, celebrating the brightest light of our family. I scrolled through the comments, each one more gushing than the last. Friends of the family praised Allison's beauty, her achievements, her supposed generosity. I noticed several relatives I hadn't seen in years toasting her in the photographs, smiling as though they had been invited to the event of the year. And then it hit me. I hadn't even known the party was happening. No phone call, no message, not even a passing mention. Once again, I had been left out invisible in the family where I was supposed to belong. The realization cut deep, not because I wanted the party or the attention, but because it confirmed what I had felt all my life. Every important family gathering, every milestone was framed around Allison. My presence was optional, if not entirely unwanted. Seeing it broadcast so publicly with words that glorified her while erasing me twisted the knife that had already been driven into my heart. I told myself not to keep looking, but I couldn't pull my eyes away. There was Allison opening gift after gift, her arms full of shopping bags from high-end brands, jewelry boxes gleaming in the soft light of the patio. My parents stood at her side, their smiles stretched wide, their pride almost tangible through the screen. I remembered my last birthday marked only by a brief text from my mother that read, "Hope it's a good one." No card, no visit, no gift. Just a reminder that I was an afterthought even on the day I was born. But it wasn't only the celebration that unsettled me. As I studied the photos, I noticed details that stirred something sharper than jealousy, something closer to suspicion. Allison had recently announced the launch of a charitable foundation, a nonprofit supposedly dedicated to funding scholarships and local community programs. She was praised widely for her altruism, and my parents bragged endlessly about her selfless heart. Yet in every new photo, she was draped in designer fashion, wearing a new luxury watch, holding handbags that cost more than a year's rent. The party itself looked extravagant enough to rival a wedding, and I couldn't stop myself from wondering where was all that money really coming from. The thought unsettled me, not because I wanted to expose her then, but because I knew how my parents adored the image of Allison as the perfect daughter. If that image cracked even slightly, their entire facade might crumble. I remembered how quick they were to dismiss me, how easily they labeled me the disgrace. If the truth about Allison's finances ever came to light, how would they handle the humiliation I shut off my phone that night and sat in silence, my chest heavy with a mix of anger and sadness? It wasn't only about the party or the gifts or the glamorous pictures. It was about the message they sent loud and clear. Allison was the pride and I was the burden. They didn't want me at their table in their photos or in their stories. I was a ghost in the family album, the daughter who was never quite enough. Yet even as my eyes burned with tears, I felt something else stir deep inside me. Watching Allison flaunt her wealth while my parents paraded her as their shining star, I realized I no longer wanted to fight for their approval. I wanted something different. I wanted the day to come when they would see me not in the shadows of Allison's spotlight, but in a place so dazzling, so undeniable that their pride would turn into silence. They had chosen their golden child, but I was determined one way or another to show them the cost of their blindness. That birthday party was not just another night I was excluded. It was the moment I began to see that their pedestal for Allison might not be as sturdy as they believed. And though I didn't know it yet, the cracks I noticed would one day widen into the downfall they never saw coming. The memory of Allison's glittering birthday still weighed on me when my parents called another family gathering, one that I knew would sting in its own way. I considered not going, but something inside urged me to show up, if only to remind myself that I still belonged in that house, even if only by blood. I walked in with my fiancé Daniel, his hand warm against mine, steadying me the way he always did. He was quiet but confident, the kind of man who carried himself with dignity. Yet I could sense the tension in the air the moment we stepped through the door, as though the entire room had been waiting for us. The conversation around the table faltered, then hushed altogether when my father cleared his throat. He looked directly at Daniel, his expression sharp and dismissive, before turning to the rest of the family. "I suppose you've all heard by now," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Rebecca insists on marrying this man. A man with no future, no ambition. A freeloader." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread across the table. My mother leaned forward, adding, "It's an embarrassment, really. Our daughter clinging to someone who contributes nothing. I've heard things, you know. He's drowning in debt, can't keep a job, and she thinks he can provide her with a life. It's pathetic." I froze, my stomach twisting as I glanced at Daniel. He sat tall, his jaw clenched, his eyes calm but steady. He didn't rise to their bait, didn't snap back, which only seemed to embolden them. My uncle chuckled, whispering loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Guess she just couldn't do better." The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable meant to humiliate not just Daniel, but me as well. I wanted to shout, to demand they stop, to tell them how wrong they were. But the words caught in my throat, choked back by years of conditioning, years of being told that speaking up would only make things worse. Instead, I pressed Daniel's hand under the table, a silent message of solidarity. He glanced at me, gave the smallest nod, and in that moment, I realized he understood. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strength, the kind of strength that didn't need to prove itself to people who had already decided to despise him. As the insults piled higher, my mind drifted to a memory I had nearly buried. My grandfather, my mother's father, had been the only person in my family who ever made me feel truly seen. I remembered sitting with him on the porch when I was a child, my knees scraped from a fall. He had taken my hands in his and told me, "Rebecca, you are not ordinary. You are stronger than you know, and one day the world will see it. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. You deserve love, the kind that lifts you up, not tears you down." He had smiled then, a soft, knowing smile that seemed to hold a secret I was too young to understand. That memory steadied me now. As my parents sneered at Daniel, calling him a burden, I thought of my grandfather's words. He had believed in me when no one else had. He had believed I was worthy of love, and Daniel had given me exactly that. Quiet, steady, unshakable love. I didn't need my parents to approve of him, because in my heart I knew my grandfather would have. The venomous words from that night didn't stay contained to the dining room. Within days, whispers began to surface in the community. At the grocery store, neighbors glanced at me with pity. A woman from church approached me with a forced smile and said I heard Daniel's having a hard time holding down a job. You poor thing. My social media filled with subtle digs from distant relatives' posts about the importance of marrying, well, clearly aimed at me. It was humiliating. Every corner of my world seemed touched by their judgment, and it was all built on lies. Daniel was not drowning in debt. He was not jobless or desperate. But explaining that to anyone would have meant revealing truths he wasn't ready to share, truths we had both agreed were better kept hidden until the right time. So I bit my tongue, enduring the whispers, the raised eyebrows, the quiet snickers. At night, when the weight of it became too much, I would sit beside Daniel and let the tears come. He would hold me, saying little, but his arms spoke louder than words. He never pressured me to defend him, never demanded I fight the rumors. Instead, he reminded me that sometimes silence was the best shield, that those who truly mattered would one day see the truth. And though the lies spread wider, though I felt more isolated than ever, a small ember of determination grew inside me. I would not expose Daniel's truth before we were ready, no matter how cruel the gossip became. Let them call him a freeloader, let them sneer about my choices. They had no idea what was coming, no idea of the power and dignity that stood quietly at my side. One day they would see, one day their words would come back to haunt them. For now, I endured their scorn with clenched fists and a steady heart, holding on to my grandfather's promise that I was worthy of love and respect. And deep down, I knew the moment would come when my parents' cruelty would unravel under the weight of their own lies. They had built their world on the illusion of perfection, but illusions have a way of breaking, and when that day came, I would not be the one left in pieces. After the ugly scene at my parents' house where Daniel was ridiculed and labeled as a burden, I thought I had reached the limit of humiliation. I told myself I could survive their cruelty as long as I had friends who truly knew me, people who had seen me through years of struggles and joys. But I quickly learned that betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those you once trusted most. It started with a phone call from Claire, my closest friend since college. She had been there when I got my first apartment, when I cried over failed relationships, when I nervously admitted I was falling in love with Daniel. If anyone understood me, it was supposed to be her. But her voice over the line was distant, colder than I had ever heard. She said she had been thinking a lot and had decided she couldn't come to my wedding. At first, I thought it was work or money or maybe something personal she didn't want to share. Then she said the words that hollowed me out. "Rebecca, I love you, but I can't support this. Your parents are right. Marrying him makes you look like you're dragging yourself down. It's embarrassing for everyone." The silence that followed was heavier than any insult my parents had thrown. Hearing it from them was one thing. Hearing it from her, the woman I considered a sister, stripped away another piece of me. I asked her softly if she had ever really known me, if she had ever cared about my happiness. Her answer was another silence followed by a quick excuse to hang up. The rejection didn't stop there. Within days, I found out through whispers and casual remarks that some of my other friends had been talking to Allison. One even admitted not knowing how much it would sting that my sister knew more about my wedding plans than she did. The truth slipped out in fragments: my guest list, my dress fittings, even the tentative date and venue I had mentioned in confidence had made their way back to my sister. Information I had shared in trust had been handed over to the one person who thrived on my pain. The realization hit me like a blow. These weren't strangers twisting rumors in the dark. These were people I had laughed with, celebrated with, confided in for years. Each secret they handed to Allison felt like another knife slipped between my ribs. I started second-guessing every conversation, every smile, every memory I had with them. Had I been foolish all along, believing they stood beside me, or had their loyalty always been swayed by the glow of my family's approval? The loneliness grew heavier. I began to avoid answering messages, stopped scrolling through social media, because every post, every picture seemed to confirm my place on the outside. My parents had rejected me. My sister reveled in her throne, and now even the friends I thought were mine had chosen the easier path, the side with more power, more money, more acceptance. But in the middle of that storm, there was Daniel. He noticed my silences, the way I sat staring at the wall long after the phone stopped buzzing. One night, when I finally admitted how abandoned I felt, he didn't try to offer false comfort or dismiss the ache. Instead, he pulled me close and said, "You're learning who they really are. Painful as it is, maybe it's better to know now than later. Because the ones who betray you for convenience were never truly yours." His words sank deep. For days I replayed them, finding a strange kind of strength in the quiet certainty of his voice. Daniel wasn't just standing beside me out of obligation. He understood what it meant to be cast aside, to be judged unfairly, to be the subject of whispers. With him, I didn't have to fight for approval or explain away rumors. He believed in me without condition. It was in those nights of whispered conversations and steady embraces that I realized he was not only my fiancé, but my anchor. The world around me could crumble. Friends could reveal themselves as traitors. Family could spit on my name. But Daniel's presence never wavered. He became the reminder that love wasn't about approval from others. It was about choosing someone who chose you every single day. What I didn't know then was that his quiet strength hid something even larger, a truth he hadn't yet shared with me. I thought his stability came only from character, from the kind of man he was. But the depth of his world, the power he carried behind his calm exterior, would later unfold in ways that would shake everyone who had ever doubted him and me. For now, all I knew was that in losing friends and trust, I had uncovered the one person whose loyalty was unshakable. And in that loyalty lay the seed of a revenge that was still waiting to bloom. It was after the string of betrayals from friends that I began noticing small things about Daniel that I had overlooked before. At first I dismissed them as quirks, habits of a man who valued privacy more than most. But one evening while I was heading down the hallway toward our living room, I caught the sound of his voice carrying a different tone. It wasn't the soft, steady voice he used with me. It was sharp, commanding, laced with authority. I paused the glow of his laptop screen reflecting against the wall, and I realized he was in the middle of a video call. I leaned closer and caught glimpses of the screen. Dozens of small boxes filled the display, each one showing a person in a suit, many of them furiously taking notes. Daniel's name wasn't listed the way mine would have been on Zoom. Instead, it read Mr. Collins. A man on the other side of the call said, "We'll move forward with your directives, sir. The market projections align with your vision." Daniel nodded once, his face firm, and replied, "Good. Make sure the acquisition is finalized by Friday. No excuses." I froze in the hallway, stunned. I had known Daniel to be thoughtful, patient, the kind of man who never raised his voice in frustration. But here he was, commanding a team of executives like a general giving orders. When he ended the call, I stepped into the room, trying to mask my surprise. He closed the laptop quickly, his eyes softening when he looked at me. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He hesitated, as though weighing how much he could share. "Work," he said simply. But I had seen enough to know it was more than just work. That was no casual office meeting, no struggling freelancer's conference call. I crossed my arms, staring at him. "They called you, sir. They called you Mr. Collins." "Daniel, what's going on?" For the first time since I had met him, Daniel seemed uncertain. He rubbed his jaw, pacing once before sitting down across from me. Finally, he met my eyes with a seriousness I had never seen before. "Rebecca, there's something I haven't told you. I didn't keep it from you because I don't trust you. I kept it because I needed to know that what we have is real." My heart pounded. What do you mean? He took a slow breath, then said the words that shifted everything I thought I knew. I'm the CEO of Collins International. It's a privately held company, one of the largest in tech. Forbes listed me in their top 50 under 40. I'm worth more than a few billion, though most people don't know it because I've always kept my life quiet. I stared at him, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. The rumors my parents spread about him being jobless, drowning in debt, suddenly seemed almost laughable in their absurdity. You're saying, you're a billionaire, I whispered. He nodded, his expression calm but vulnerable. Yes, but I never wanted that to define us. I wanted to be sure you loved me for me, not for what I could provide. I've seen too many people drawn to me for the wrong reasons. With you, I needed to be certain. And Rebecca, you've shown me something no one else ever has. You stood by me while the world mocked us. You defended me even when it cost you your place with your family. That's why I'm telling you this now. Because I trust you completely. The room seemed to shrink around me, every detail sharper, every sound louder. I thought back to the sneers of my parents, the pitying looks from neighbors, the silence of so-called friends. They had all judged him, judged us, without ever knowing the truth. And now here he was, laying that truth bare in my hands. A mix of shock and relief flooded me. For weeks I had felt like we were drowning under lies, barely staying afloat against the tide of humiliation. But now suddenly I saw a future not of despair, but of possibility. The whispers about his failures were nothing but smoke, and I was the only one standing in the light of who he really was. Daniel reached for my hand, his touch steady as always. I need you to keep this between us, at least for now, he said. The time will come when the truth will reveal itself. Until then, let them underestimate me. Let them underestimate us. Their arrogance will make the fall that much harder. I squeezed his hand, my voice firm despite the storm inside me. I'll keep your secret. But when the time comes, I want to be there standing beside you when they finally see who you really are. He smiled, then a smile of quiet triumph, and I realized that together we were building something far greater than a wedding. We were laying the groundwork for a reckoning, one that would expose every cruel word my family had thrown and turn it back on them. That night, for the first time in months, I felt the weight of shame lift from my shoulders. No longer was I the daughter discarded, the fiancé mocked. I was the partner of a man far more powerful than they could imagine, and together we were preparing for the moment when silence would shatter and revenge would take its rightful place. After Daniel revealed who he truly was, the air around us seemed to change. For weeks I had carried the weight of humiliation, walking with my head lowered, while neighbors and relatives whispered lies about him, about us. Now every time I looked at him, I no longer saw the man they mocked, but the man he had always been, the one strong enough to let the world underestimate him until the right moment came. That moment was approaching faster than I could have imagined. When Daniel first brought up the Malibu estate, I thought he was joking. I had seen photos of that oceanfront property before, with its sprawling lawns, glass walls reflecting the sea, and terraces that seemed to float over the cliffs. It was the kind of place where celebrities held fundraisers, or where magazine spreads were shot, not the kind of venue I imagined for my wedding after being called a disgrace by my own parents. But Daniel spoke with quiet certainty. If we're going to do this, Rebecca, we're going to do it right. Not to prove anything to them, but to give us the celebration we deserve. The first time we visited, I felt my breath catch as we walked the grounds. The Pacific stretched endlessly in front of us, the sun glinting off the waves like shards of glass. The gardens were meticulously kept, every flower blooming as if rehearsed for this moment. As we toured the space, I could almost hear the music that would one day play. See the guests mingling under the stars, imagine myself walking down the aisle, not as the daughter cast aside, but as a woman who had risen above it all. When Daniel signed the contract and placed the deposit, I felt something shift inside me. It was no longer just a wedding. It was the promise of transformation. We decided from the very beginning that this would not be a public spectacle for anyone who happened to share our blood. There would be no invitations sent to my parents, no gestures of reconciliation, no seats reserved out of obligation. The guest list would be carefully curated, filled with people who had supported us, who had believed in me, in us, when others tried to tear us apart. Each name we wrote felt like an act of defiance, a declaration that love and loyalty mattered more than appearances. At night, I would lie awake remembering the night my father shredded my wedding invitation and called me an embarrassment. That image had haunted me, but now it only fueled my resolve. I realized how far I had come from the girl crying in her car outside their house to the woman standing on the edge of a Malibu cliff, preparing to marry the man who had chosen me not for status or convenience, but for love. For the first time in my life, I didn't crave their approval. I didn't want their presence. What I wanted was for them to feel the emptiness of being left out, the same emptiness I had felt my entire life. The secrecy became part of the thrill. We worked with planners who signed confidentiality agreements, caterers who delivered under coded names, designers who swore to keep their sketches locked away. Every detail was chosen with care, from the string quartet to the menu designed by a chef whose name alone could draw headlines. There was a sweetness in knowing my family would never suspect a thing, until the truth unfolded in front of the world. One afternoon, as we reviewed floral arrangements, Daniel's assistant approached him with news that added an unexpected twist. A major television network had heard whispers of the wedding and wanted to broadcast it. At first, the thought made me uneasy. The idea of cameras capturing every moment felt too public, too exposed. But when Daniel explained why they were interested, my hesitation melted into a sense of destiny. They didn't just want the wedding for entertainment. They wanted to showcase it as part of a special highlighting his charitable foundation. Every dollar raised during the broadcast would go to funding scholarships and community programs. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about turning the night that symbolized our union into something greater, something meaningful that would ripple outward. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents had paraded Allison as the generous, accomplished daughter, using her supposed charitable work as a crown to place on her head. And here we were, preparing a wedding that would quietly overshadow every accolade she had ever claimed. Daniel's foundation was real, impactful, and now the world would see it. As the weeks went on, I found myself smiling more, walking taller. Where once I had been consumed by shame, I now felt anticipation building like the crescendo of a symphony. Every fitting, every tasting, every meeting carried the weight of more than just wedding planning. It was the construction of a moment I had been waiting for my whole life, a moment where I would finally step out from the shadows of dismissal and into the light of recognition. Not because my parents gave it to me, but because I created it for myself. Late one evening, standing with Daniel on the terrace of the estate, I looked out at the dark ocean waves crashing against the cliffs. I thought of the girl my grandfather once told was stronger than she knew. The girl who had been called a disgrace. And I whispered to myself that he had been right. I was stronger. I was becoming the woman who would no longer bend under the weight of rejection. And as Daniel wrapped his arm around me, I knew that soon, very soon, the world would see it too. What none of them expected, least of all my parents and sister, was that their cruelty had lit the very fire that would lead me here. And when the day came when the cameras rolled and the guests filled the estate, their absence would not be a quiet omission. It would be a glaring silence, one that told the world exactly what they had thrown away. Just when I thought I had built enough strength to rise above their cruelty, another blow came sharper than the last. The Malibu estate had been secured, the plans quietly unfolding with precision and secrecy. For the first time in years, I felt I had control over my own story. But control is exactly what my family despised me having. They struck in a way I didn't anticipate, weaving deception that clawed at my dignity in front of the very people I had grown up around. It started with a message from a distant cousin. She sent me a photograph of what looked like one of my wedding invitations. At first glance, I thought perhaps she had somehow gotten one through a mutual friend, but the details made my blood run cold. The card was cheap, the font garish, and instead of listing the Malibu estate, it named a rundown banquet hall on the outskirts of town, a place often used for budget birthday parties or bingo nights. My cousin's note was laced with sarcasm. "Couldn't even get a church, huh? Guess your parents were right." Confusion turned to dread as more messages followed. An aunt posted on social media about how tragic it was that I was throwing my life away in a cheap hall with a worthless groom. Comments piled on, some laughing, others expressing pity, all of them circling around the same falsehood that this mockery of a celebration was my wedding. My parents had orchestrated the entire charade, printing dozens of fake invitations and spreading them through the family tree like poison. The intention was clear. They wanted everyone to believe that I was desperate, delusional, and beneath the dignity of the family name. The humiliation was suffocating. I sat on the floor of my bedroom, the fake invitation clutched in my hand, tears blurring the words that slandered not just me, but Daniel as well. It was not enough for them to reject me privately. They needed to dismantle me publicly to turn my wedding into a punchline at the expense of my happiness. In the silence of that room, memories I had tried to bury came rushing back. I saw myself as a little girl at my 8th birthday, standing before a cake with candles glowing brightly. I had closed my eyes, made a wish, and blown them out, only to open my eyes and see my mother's face twisted with irritation. "Why can't you smile as beautifully as Allison?" She had scolded, her voice sharp enough to make the other children shift uncomfortably. I remembered shrinking into myself, feeling that my joy was always measured against my sister's perfection and found lacking. That same emptiness returned now, decades later. No matter how hard I tried, they always found a way to remind me I was less unworthy, unwanted. My tears fell fast, pooling on the scraps of the fake invitation, until my sobs left me gasping for air. For a moment I wanted to give up the fight. Why keep trying when even my own blood delighted in tearing me apart? But Daniel's family refused to let me drown. His mother came to see me that evening, bringing with her a warmth I had never known from my own. She sat beside me, taking the crumpled invitation from my hands, and said softly, "Rebecca, you cannot let their lies define you. They are terrified of your strength because they know deep down you are not what they say." His father, a man of few words, added with quiet certainty, "When people try this hard to bury you, it's because they know you're capable of rising higher than they ever will." Their words seeped into the cracks of my despair, steadying me like a hand pulling me from deep water. Daniel, always my anchor, knelt before me and brushed away my tears. "This is what they do best, destroy. But that's not who we are. Our wedding will be a moment they can never touch. Let them spread their lies now, Rebecca. When the truth comes out, it will crush them." Something inside me shifted. My tears slowed, replaced by a slow burning determination. I realized my parents' scheme had given me exactly what I needed, proof of their desperation. They had to invent lies because they couldn't stop the truth that was coming. They were clinging to their illusion of superiority, blind to the reality that the ground beneath them was already cracking. That night, I tucked the fake invitation into a box, not as a keepsake of pain, but as evidence, a reminder of just how far they were willing to go to destroy me. And instead of breaking me, it ignited something stronger. I no longer wanted their acceptance or even their acknowledgement. I wanted them to feel the same sting of humiliation they had forced on me, only magnified 100 times over. For years they had thrown me aside like an afterthought. Now I would give them a lesson they would never forget. And as I lay in bed beside Daniel, his hand resting firmly over mine, I whispered a silent promise to myself. They would regret every lie, every insult, every tear they had drawn from me. The day was coming when the truth would not just be seen. It would be impossible to ignore. In the days following the cruel stunt with the fake invitations, I carried a quiet fury inside me, but I also carried something stronger: resolve. I was no longer the girl who begged for scraps of affection from her family. I was the woman planning a future so far above their narrow world that it would eclipse every insult they had ever thrown. It was Daniel who reminded me of this when he sat me down one evening, his eyes bright with excitement, a leather-bound guest list spread across the table. "Rebecca," he said softly, sliding the book toward me. "I think it's time you see who will be standing with us on that day." I opened it, expecting names of friends, colleagues perhaps, business partners. Instead, the first line made me catch my breath. There was the name of an actress whose face graced billboards and magazine covers, a woman whose charity work had earned her admiration across the country. Next came a senator, one I had watched on television since I was a teenager, a man whose speeches carried weight in Washington. As I turned the pages, I saw the names of CEOs I recognized from headlines, authors whose books lined my shelves, and artists whose work hung in galleries I had only ever dreamed of visiting. Each name seemed more impossible than the last yet. Daniel spoke each one with certainty. "These aren't just acquaintances," he explained. "They are people who respect what we are building together. They believe in the work the foundation is doing, and they want to be part of this moment. Our wedding isn't just a personal celebration. It's going to symbolize something bigger: integrity, resilience, love that refuses to break under pressure." My heart swelled as I traced the ink with my fingers. I imagined the guests arriving at the Malibu estate, stepping out of sleek cars onto the stone driveway, their presence turning the event into something grander than anything my family had ever hosted for Allison. While my parents clung to their golden child and her fading glow, Daniel and I were preparing to step into a spotlight so radiant it would blind them. But the most unexpected gift came not from Daniel's world, but from mine, or rather from my past. One afternoon I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, looping, and elegant, but the name at the bottom stopped me cold. It was from George Whitman, an old friend of my grandfather's. He had been a frequent visitor to our home when I was little, though I hadn't seen him in decades. Inside the letter, his words carried the warmth of memory. "Your grandfather often spoke of you, Rebecca," it read. "He told me more than once that you were his brightest light, though others could not see it. He believed you would do great things, not in the way your parents measured greatness, but in the way that truly mattered, by living with courage and heart. I hear you are preparing for your wedding, and though I cannot be there in person, I want you to know that his love for you was real, and I am proud of the woman you have become." I read the letter 3 times, my vision blurring with tears. To know that my grandfather, the one person who had ever made me feel truly valued, had spoken of me. That way, it was like a hand reaching through time to lift me up. His friend's words were a reminder that even if my parents had buried their love for me under layers of disdain, I had not imagined his affection. He had seen me, believed in me, and his faith was still alive in the people who had known him. I held that letter to my chest, and for the first time in weeks, I felt peace. Between Daniel's world of power and my grandfather's lingering voice of love, I knew I was not as alone as my family wanted me to believe. The weight of their rejection no longer pressed so hard on my chest. Instead, I felt the stirring of anticipation, like the moment before a curtain rises on a long-awaited performance. At night, when I closed my eyes, I began to picture it in detail. I saw Allison scrolling through her phone, her smirk fading as images of our wedding flooded every platform, images of me walking down the aisle with Hollywood's elite, watching of senators shaking Daniel's hand, of the estate glowing like a palace against the ocean. I imagined my parents' faces as the broadcast played on national television, their expressions hardening then breaking as they realized the daughter they had discarded had built a life grander than anything they could have orchestrated for their favored child. The thought didn't just comfort me, it fueled me. Every fitting, every meeting, every whispered plan became infused with that vision of their shock. I wanted to savor it not out of vanity, but out of justice. They had laughed at me, humiliated me, and spread lies about me. Soon their laughter would die in their throats, and the world would witness it. As Daniel and I finalized the plans, I tucked George Whitman's letter into the same box where I had placed the fake invitation my parents had created. Together, the 2 items told the story of my journey, the cruelty that tried to break me, and the love past and present that reminded me I was never as small as they wanted me to feel. One was a scar. The other was a torch. And with both, I walked forward ready for the day that would change everything. The morning of the wedding broke with a golden light spilling across the Pacific, the kind of sunlight that seemed almost staged, as though even nature had been rehearsed for this moment. The Malibu estate stood radiant against the cliffs, its terraces adorned with cascades of white roses, crystal chandeliers hanging beneath silk canopies, and a carpet of petals that lined the aisle leading toward the sea. Every detail shimmered with intention, every corner whispered elegance. For months, I had carried the weight of humiliation, the sting of lies, and the ache of rejection. But as I slipped into the gown waiting for me, I felt the old heaviness dissolve into something else, power. The dress had been custom-made, a masterpiece of ivory silk with intricate beading that caught the light like a constellation. When the veil was placed over my hair and the final clasp secured, I looked into the mirror and saw not the discarded daughter my parents had branded, but a woman who had risen unbroken into her own brilliance. The murmur of guests outside grew louder, the hum of anticipation rolling through the estate like a current. My heart pounded not from fear, but from a fierce certainty that this was my moment. The music swelled as the doors opened, and I stepped forward into the light. Gasps echoed across the courtyard as all eyes turned toward me. On either side of the aisle, guests rose to their feet. Hollywood stars whose faces I had once seen only on screens, business magnates who shaped industries, philanthropists known for reshaping communities, political figures whose decisions rippled across the nation. They were here, all of them, to witness my wedding. Cameras clicked like thunder flashes, igniting the air as journalists fought to capture every detail. I caught fragments of whispers. "She looks like royalty. This is bigger than any gala I've ever seen. It feels like a royal wedding." The comparison followed me with every step, the magnitude of the moment stretching far beyond what I had ever dreamed. And with each footfall down that aisle, I felt the accusations of disgrace fall away, replaced by a radiance no one could deny. Daniel stood waiting at the altar, his eyes steady and proud, dressed in a tailored suit that carried the quiet strength of the man I loved. Behind him, the ocean stretched endlessly, waves crashing like applause against the cliffs. For a fleeting second, I wished my grandfather could see me then, but deep inside I knew he already did. As vows were exchanged and rings slipped onto fingers, the air seemed to hold its breath. Applause erupted as we were pronounced husband and wife, a roar of celebration that mingled with the cries of seagulls overhead. For the first time, I felt the world celebrating me, not despite my parents' absence, but because of it. Their silence in that grand moment spoke louder than their presence ever could have. The reception unfolded like a dream. The estate glowed under strings of lights, tables set with crystal and silver. The hum of conversation punctuated by laughter and clinking glasses. Guests mingled, journalists weaved through the crowd, and everywhere I turned, someone was offering congratulations, their admiration genuine, their respect undeniable. Then, as if the day could not carry more weight, one of the most famous actresses in attendance lifted her phone and posted a photograph of me walking down the aisle. The caption read, "Tonight, I witnessed grace and strength personified." Rebecca is proof that true dignity rises from adversity. Within minutes, the post spread like wildfire, shared and reshared across platforms, drawing comments from millions who had never known my name until that night. I saw it happen in real time. Reporters huddled together, whispering about how the wedding had already begun, trending nationwide. A headline flashed on a tablet someone carried, "A wedding like royalty in Malibu." Guests smiled, knowingly aware they were part of something that would not be forgotten. As I stood on the terrace looking out at the sea of faces who had chosen to stand with me, I imagined the living rooms of my parents and sister. I imagined them staring at their screens, watching as the world embraced the daughter they had cast aside. And though I could not see their faces, I knew the shock was there, the disbelief settling into their bones, as the reality they had tried so hard to deny unfolded in front of the entire nation. That night, as music swirled and the ocean roared in rhythm, I realized that the revenge I had once envisioned did not need to be loud or cruel. It was enough that the truth was undeniable, that the world could see me in the brilliance my family had tried to bury. For the first time in my life, I was not begging to be seen. I was seen. And there was no taking that away. As the evening unfolded at the Malibu estate with laughter music and the glow of lights shimmering against the ocean, I had no idea how far the reach of our wedding would extend beyond those gates. While I was busy greeting guests and savoring the moment, an entire production crew from a major television network was broadcasting the ceremony and reception live. What began as a quiet arrangement between Daniel's foundation and the network had turned into a national event. Millions of people tuned in across the country, their curiosity piqued by Daniel's reputation and the whispers that this wedding would be unlike any other. Television anchors introduced the broadcast with language usually reserved for royal occasions. Tonight we bring you the wedding of Daniel Collins, a name well known in business circles, and Rebecca, his bride, whose story of perseverance and love has captured hearts. The footage cut to thy estate, panning across sweeping terraces filled with celebrities and luminaries, while the hosts marveled at the grandeur. Each shot captured the elegance, the opulence, and the unmistakable joy radiating from the night. To the public, I was no longer the nameless woman behind cruel rumors. I was the center of a story that carried both spectacle and substance. Far from Malibu, my parents and Allison were hosting one of their usual gatherings. They had friends over neighbors sipping wine in their living room, the television flickering in the background with muted sound. Allison, in her carefully curated dress, basked in compliments, while my mother poured drinks and my father boasted about his daughter's so-called achievements. It was a scene of smug comfort, one that they had cultivated for years, feeding on the admiration of others. But then someone adjusted the remote, turning up the volume. The room stilled as the network's voice filled the space. We now return to live coverage from the Collins wedding in Malibu. The camera cut to me, stepping onto the terrace in my gown, the crowd of elite guests applauding, the ocean sparkling in the background. For a long, breathless moment, no one in that living room spoke. My mother's hand froze mid-pour, the wine spilling over the rim of a glass. My father's jaw tightened, his boastful smile collapsing into disbelief. And Allison, the golden child who had always been paraded as the family's crown jewel, stared at the screen with wide eyes, her lips parted but silent. The people around them began whispering, their curiosity overtaking the polite silence. One guest leaned closer to my mother. "Isn't that your daughter?" Another pointed at the screen where I was laughing with a famous actress, my image radiating across the room. "She looks extraordinary." The questions hung heavy needles, pricking the carefully woven fabric of their pride. My parents didn't answer. They couldn't. As the broadcast continued, showing Daniel shaking hands with senators, artists, and philanthropists, Allison's face twisted with something darker than jealousy. It was realization, the dawning truth that her spotlight had been eclipsed by the sister she had scorned. Every smile I gave, every word of admiration spoken about me on that broadcast, cut into her like a blade. And my parents, who had dismissed me as a disgrace, sat mute, their social circle watching their facade unravel in real time. The impact spread quickly beyond their living room. Across the family tree, cousins and aunts and distant relatives tuned in, some out of curiosity, others by chance. And one of them, unable to contain their astonishment, posted on social media, "I can't believe it, Rebecca's wedding is on national television. Malibu estate celebrities everywhere. She looks stunning. Did anyone know?" The post spread rapidly, screenshots of the broadcast flooding timelines, hashtags forming comments piling on from strangers and acquaintances alike. Suddenly, the narrative my parents had worked so hard to craft, the discarded daughter, the embarrassment was shattered. In its place rose an entirely new image, one they could not control. People were tagging Allison, tagging my parents, demanding explanations. Why weren't you there? Why didn't you celebrate her? She looks incredible. Each notification was a blow, each question a reminder of the choices they had made, choices now exposed under the harsh light of public scrutiny. Back at the estate, I remained unaware of the chaos unraveling miles away. But perhaps part of me had anticipated it. As I looked around at the faces of people who celebrated me, who saw my worth without conditions, I felt the power of something larger than myself. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a broadcast of truth transmitted into living rooms across the country, into the very home of those who had cast me aside. For once, they could not deny me. They could not rewrite the story or whisper it away in private. The world was watching, and the world saw me not as a disgrace, but as a bride radiant with love, standing tall beside a man who believed in me. The shock that must have washed over them, the silence that must have filled their gathering, was the first taste of justice. It was the beginning of their unraveling, and it was only the start. The celebration at the estate was in full swing, the music carrying across the terraces, glasses clinking as guests toasted under strings of glowing lights. I had just finished a round of conversations with people I never thought I would meet, actors, senators, philanthropists, when Daniel took my hand and led me toward a quieter corner. The air was cool, the ocean stretching dark and endless beyond the cliffs. For the first time that evening, I allowed myself to breathe in the weight of it all. But before I could even savor the peace, my phone buzzed in my clutch. At first I thought it was one of the planners, or perhaps a congratulatory message from a friend unable to attend. But when I pulled it out and saw the names flashing on the screen, my pulse stilled. It was my parents. And Allison. The three of them, who had not spoken to me except in insults and dismissals for months, had sent a single message, simple and stark. "Can we come?" For a moment, I simply stared at the words, my breath caught between laughter and disbelief. They had called me a disgrace, shredded my invitation, tossed me aside like a stain on their reputation. They had mocked me, humiliated me, spread lies that left me ostracized in my own community. And now, with the glow of cameras reflecting off my gown, with millions watching what was being called the event of the year, they wanted entry. Not out of love, not out of remorse, but out of desperation to be seen standing beside me when the world's eyes were fixed on my triumph. I tilted the phone so Daniel could see. He read the message, his mouth curving into a smile that was half amusement, half warning. "They can't stand being left outside," he murmured. "This isn't about you, Rebecca. It never was. It's about their pride." His words rang true. I remembered every moment of rejection, my father's voice sharp with scorn as he called me an embarrassment. My mother's eyes filled with disappointment every time I failed to measure up to Allison. My sister's smirk as she watched me crumble, relishing each crack in my composure. And now they wanted to walk through the gates of the Malibu estate to bask in the glow they had once tried to snuff out. I turned the phone over in my hand, the glow of the screen painting my face in pale light. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt something colder, steadier. A slow smile touched my lips, the kind of smile born not from joy, but from the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice take form. They were begging in their own small way. That message, those 3 words, carried the weight of their defeat. I didn't type a response. Not yet. I slid the phone back into my clutch, letting the unanswered plea hang in the air like a storm cloud. Their desperation would only grow heavier the longer I kept them waiting, and I intended to savor every second of it. The irony was too sharp to ignore. In the same week that the nation was watching me marry at a $40 million estate, my parents and sister were reduced to sending a text like unwelcome guests outside a locked door. It was the reversal I had once only dreamed of, and now it was reality. The pain they had inflicted, the years of being unseen, had twisted into this moment of quiet, devastating triumph. Around us, the party continued, the cameras rolling, the reporters weaving through the crowd. Unbeknownst to me, one of the journalists had already caught wind of whispers about my estranged family. A single tweet surfaced from an entertainment reporter. Rumor has it the bride's family wasn't invited. Anyone else notice their absence? It didn't take long for the speculation to spiral. Hashtags appeared, questions swirled, and soon the contrast was glaring. Where were my parents and sister on the biggest night of my life? The irony wasn't lost on the audience at home, many of whom had seen the way Allison was often paraded as the star child in family posts. Now their absence was louder than their presence could have been, and the speculation became its own form of entertainment. Strangers dissected the possibilities, online gossip sites began reaching out for statements, and suddenly the family who had once controlled the narrative was no longer holding the pen. I sipped my champagne and let the music carry me back into the crowd, my secret tucked away with the phone in my clutch. The unanswered message was like a flame in the dark, its glow steady, its burn inevitable. I knew they would send more, perhaps even call, their panic escalating as the hours passed. And I also knew this was only the beginning. The world was already watching. Soon, everyone would see not only the beauty of my wedding, but the fractures of the family that had cast me out. As I moved among the guests, laughter spilling around me, I felt lighter than I had in years. For once, I wasn't weighed down by their rejection. Instead, I was lifted by their desperation, by the knowledge that I held the power now. Their pride was crumbling, their control unraveling, and all it had taken was the truth made visible on the biggest stage possible. Somewhere in a house filled with silence, they were waiting for a reply that would never come, not tonight. And that knowledge was sweeter than any toast, any headline, any congratulatory post. It was the beginning of their reckoning, and I intended to let it play out one unanswered message at a time. While I danced beneath the chandeliers of the Malibu estate, my phone still holding their unanswered plea, my family was plotting their next move. Silence from me had only fueled their desperation. If they could not secure an invitation through begging, they would attempt to seize one through deceit. The arrogance that had always driven them, this belief that rules were made for others, but never for them, was about to deliver the humiliation they so richly deserved. Late in the evening, as the reception swelled with music and laughter, a sleek black limousine rolled up to the gates of the estate. Cameras from the press that had been stationed outside immediately turned their lenses toward it, assuming it was another late-arriving dignitary or celebrity. The tinted windows lowered just enough to reveal my parents and Allison dressed as though they belonged among the glittering crowd inside. My mother wore a gown meant to command attention. Allison sparkled in jewels she had borrowed, and my father's expression carried the smugness of a man convinced his name alone would open doors. But the estate's security was unyielding. The guards stepped forward, checking the guest list with precision. "Names, please," one of them asked, clipboard in hand. My father gave his surname with authority, as though expecting it to be recognized instantly. Instead, the guard's expression remained blank. He scanned the list, flipped a page, then shook his head. "You're not on the list." My father's voice rose sharp with indignation. "That can't be possible. This is my daughter's wedding. We are her family." He gestured toward Allison, who gave a practiced smile for the cameras that were now capturing every second of the scene. "Surely you understand." My mother added, her tone sugary but urgent. The guard's reply was steady, professional, and loud enough for the surrounding journalists to hear. "If you're not on the list, you're not allowed in, family or not." He signaled to the other guards, who formed a solid line in front of the limousine, blocking any attempt to advance. The cameras clicked furiously. Reporters leaned closer. Microphones extended the story, unfolding in real time. Here was the family that had abandoned me now, reduced to pleading at the gates of the very wedding they had once scorned. My father's face turned red. My mother's composure slipped into frantic whispers, and Allison's smile faltered as she realized the spectacle was spiraling out of control. Within minutes, the footage was broadcast live on social media. A clip of the guard stating firmly, "You're not on the list," spread like wildfire, captioned with variations of disbelief and mockery. Comments flooded in. Imagine humiliating your own daughter, then trying to crash her billionaire wedding. Karma came dressed in security uniforms tonight. They raised their golden girl, and now they're stuck outside the gates. As the videos spread, their humiliation deepened. They had not just been rejected, they had been rejected publicly, their arrogance immortalized in images and headlines. Journalists wasted no time connecting the dots, publishing articles about the strained family ties, quoting the earlier rumors of disownment, and speculating why the bride had left them off the guest list. The narrative was out of their control, and the world was reveling in their disgrace. The final blow came from someone I hadn't heard from in years, an old friend from high school who had once witnessed firsthand how Allison was pampered while I was overlooked. She shared one of the viral clips with a caption that cut through the noise. Funny how they called her a disgrace, and now they're the ones being turned away at the door. Poetic justice at its finest. The post gained thousands of shares, amplified by strangers who had never known me but felt the sting of the injustice and the sweetness of its reversal. Inside the estate, I remained blissfully unaware of the exact details until later, but a ripple of amusement began to move through the guests. Whispered exchanges, sly smiles, and even a few guests pulling out their phones to show each other the unfolding chaos outside reached me in fragments. I didn't need to see the footage to know what was happening. I could feel it in the air, the sense that something larger than my own planning had taken hold, that the universe itself was conspiring to deliver the justice my family had long evaded. While they stood humiliated at the gates, I stood in the center of my own celebration, surrounded by people who chose to be there not because of obligation or image, but because of loyalty and love. The contrast could not have been sharper. Their desperation had driven them to gamble on spectacle, and instead it had turned into their downfall. They had wanted the world to see them reclaim control. Instead, the world saw them begging for scraps of a story they no longer owned. Later that night, when Daniel finally showed me the videos and the articles, I couldn't help the small, cold smile that touched my lips. I didn't need to say anything. Their humiliation had spoken louder than I ever could. The humiliation at the gates had been more than Allison could bear. For years, she had been the center of attention, the darling of every family gathering, the one my parents draped in praise and paraded before the world. But now, after being turned away in front of cameras and mocked online, her carefully crafted image began to crack. And like anyone who has lived too long on the pedestal of entitlement, when she fell hard. It started with a shaky video recorded on her phone. Furious and red-eyed, Allison spoke directly into the camera, her voice rising with the bitterness she could no longer contain. "Everyone thinks Rebecca is some kind of saint," she sneered, her tone dripping with venom. "But you don't know the truth. She doesn't deserve him. I do. I should be the one marrying Daniel. Do you really think she has what it takes to stand beside a man like him? No. That should have been me." She ranted for several minutes, listing imaginary flaws of mind-weaving lies with desperation. What she didn't realize was that the cameras outside the estate were still rolling, and reporters caught every word as she raised her voice, gesturing wildly. The clip hit social media within minutes. At first, it was shared as gossip, a shocking meltdown from the bride's estranged sister. But soon, the tone shifted. Commenters didn't see a woman wronged. They saw a spoiled, entitled adult throwing a tantrum because the spotlight had shifted. "This is embarrassing," one comment read. "She sounds like a teenager jealous of the prom queen." Another wrote, "So you humiliate your own sister, then cry that you should be the one marrying her husband? Yikes." The more people watched, the more the mockery grew. Memes sprouted overnight. Screenshots of Allison mid-rant were paired with captions like, "When your golden crown slips, and imagine thinking you're the main character." Even respected commentators weighed in, noting how her words revealed the toxic favoritism that had poisoned my family for years. The public that once might have envied Allison's privileged life now saw her as a caricature of entitlement, someone so blinded by her own reflection she couldn't see the absurdity of her jealousy. Inside the estate, the whispers spread quickly. Guests who had once only known Allison as the successful golden child were showing each other the video on their phones, shaking their heads, laughing, pitying me for having endured such a sister. But for the first time, I didn't feel pity for myself. When Daniel finally showed me the clip holding his phone out with raised brows, I watched in silence as Allison's tirade spilled out. At the end of it, I felt not anger, not sorrow, but something close to relief. For years I had carried the burden of trying to prove myself against her, of standing straighter, speaking softer, working harder just to be seen as enough. And now she had undone herself without me lifting a finger. The world could see her exactly as I always had, not as a shining star, but as someone desperate to hold on to a crown that never truly belonged to her. The truth was spilling out of her own mouth, leaving me free of the weight I had carried since childhood. I leaned back in my chair, a faint smile tugging at my lips. Daniel studied me, searching my face for pain. But there was none. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm more than all right," I said softly. "For the first time, I don't have to explain. She did it for me." That night, as the music continued and the celebration swirled around us, I felt lighter than I had in years. Allison's outburst wasn't just a tantrum, it was a revelation, a mirror held up for the world to see the rot beneath the golden sheen. And the beauty of it all was that I hadn't needed to orchestrate a thing. She had destroyed her own pedestal with her own hands. The backlash against her grew louder with every passing hour, her image collapsing under the weight of her own words. And while she scrambled to explain herself, I simply enjoyed the moment, savoring the justice that came not from revenge, but from truth laid bare. It was a satisfaction, deeper than anger, sweeter than triumph. The golden sister had finally revealed her rust, and I no longer felt the need to shine against her. My light stood on its own. After Allison's meltdown had spread across every corner of social media, I thought there could be no sweeter moment than watching her unravel under the weight of her own arrogance. But then I remembered the message still waiting in my phone, 3 little words that carried the desperation of my entire family. "Can we come?" For hours I had let it sit unanswered, savoring the silence, knowing that every passing minute made them more frantic. Yet the time had come to give them the closure they deserved. I slipped away to a quieter corner of the estate, the music and laughter muffled behind me. The glow of the phone illuminated my face as I reopened their message. I thought of the years I had spent begging for scraps of affection, the countless times my parents had dismissed me. The cruel words they had spoken, the way Allison had been raised like a queen while I was treated like an afterthought. I thought of my father shredding my wedding invitation in front of a room full of relatives, of my mother's cold stare, of Allison's smug laughter as she watched me break. And now they wanted to share the spotlight they had tried so hard to extinguish. I typed 2 words, each keystroke deliberate, sharp, final. Too late. I didn't need to embellish or explain. The words themselves carried everything I wanted them to feel: finality, rejection, justice. With a steady hand, I hit send. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly those words would find their way beyond my parents' phones. Within an hour, screenshots began to surface online. At first I thought it was just gossip, a leak passed between relatives. But then I saw the headlines forming bold letters across news sites and gossip blogs: "Bride to estranged family, too late." The phrase became a rallying cry, quoted and shared, a symbol of defiance that resonated far beyond my story. The reaction was swift and merciless. Comment sections filled with outrage, not at me, but at my family. People dissected the cruelty of disowning a daughter only to beg their way into her wedding once it became clear she had risen higher than they ever dreamed. They made their choice, one user wrote. Now they can live with it. Others praised me, calling me strong, dignified, a woman who had finally drawn the line against years of abuse. For every insult my parents had thrown, there were now thousands of voices lifting me up, strangers who saw in my refusal a kind of justice they had longed for in their own lives. Even among relatives, the tide shifted. Cousins who had once kept their distance now posted cryptic remarks online, thinly veiled jabs at my parents. Funny how the tables turn, one wrote. Another shared a photo from the broadcast of me smiling in my gown captioned, "Proud of you, Rebecca." For the first time, my parents weren't the center of admiration, they were the center of ridicule. Their authority within the family tree crumbled, replaced by whispers and laughter that no amount of denial could erase. Daniel found me standing by the terrace as the news broke wider. He slipped his arm around my waist, his presence steady grounding. "It's out there now," he said, showing me his phone where the phrase "too late" was already trending nationwide. "You've just said what so many people have always wanted to say." I leaned into him, feeling the strength of his certainty beneath the polished suit, the man who had chosen me, not just to stand beside him, but to rise with him. Looking out over the ocean, I realized that the victory wasn't in the headlines or the trending hashtags. It was in the calm I felt inside, the sense that I had finally closed a chapter that had haunted me for years. I hadn't screamed, I hadn't begged, I had simply spoken the truth in the simplest possible way, and it was enough. Back at the estate, the celebration continued, guests unaware of the digital storm raging outside. Or perhaps they were aware, judging by the sly smiles, the subtle glances at their phones, the murmurs that rippled across the room. I caught snippets of admiration, words like dignity and strength whispered as I passed. But I didn't need their approval. The calm on my face, the steadiness in my steps was enough. In the end, the sweetest revenge wasn't the grandeur of the estate, the presence of celebrities, or even the national broadcast. It was the two words that echoed louder than all of it, two words that stripped my parents of the control they had wielded over me for so long. Too late. And as I stood beside Daniel, my hand resting in his, I knew that those words would follow them far longer than any spotlight would follow me. They had written my role as the disgrace, but I had rewritten the ending. And now it was their turn to live with the silence I had left them. The phrase, "too late," was still echoing across news sites and social media feeds when the first whispers of another storm began to form. At first, it was small, almost overlooked, a local journalist posting that Allison's charitable foundation had irregularities in its financial statements. But what started as a passing remark quickly caught the attention of larger outlets, and soon an investigative reporter with a national reputation took up the trail. Within days, the golden veneer my sister had polished for years began to crack in public view. The article hit with the force of a hammer. Line after line detailed how Allison had siphoned donations meant for children's programs and community outreach, funneling the money into her own luxuries. Designer handbags, international vacations, a brand new car registered in her name, all paid for with funds meant to put books in schools and meals in pantries. The evidence was overwhelming: bank transfers, expense reports, emails she thought were hidden but had been obtained by the reporter. Her foundation, once hailed in glowing profiles as her crowning achievement, was now revealed as little more than a personal slush fund. My parents tried to act quickly. Statements were drafted claiming there had been an accounting error, that Allison had been misled by incompetent staff. My mother called in favors with community leaders, begging them to vouch for Allison's character. My father threatened legal action against the newspaper, insisting the story was exaggerated. But the harder they fought, the more damning details emerged. The investigation expanded, uncovering a pattern that stretched back years. Allison had been stealing from her own donors, betraying not only strangers but friends who had trusted her name. The fallout was swift. Donors demanded refunds. Local organizations severed ties. The community that had once held my parents in esteem now turned on them, their voices rising in outrage. Neighborhood gatherings that had once been showcases of Allison's charm became hotbeds of gossip and condemnation. Even my parents' oldest allies began to distance themselves, unwilling to be tainted by the scandal. Their house, once filled with visitors eager to bask in their prestige, grew silent. The golden glow that had shielded them for so long was gone, replaced by shadows they could not control. I watched all of it unfold from a distance, my hands never touching a keyboard, my voice never entering the fray. I didn't need to. The truth spoke louder than I ever could. Every headline, every outraged comment, every news segment was a kind of justice that no amount of personal confrontation could have delivered. Allison's pedestal built on lies and favoritism was collapsing under its own weight. And my parents, who had spent their lives propping her up, were being dragged down with her. Friends sent me links, acquaintances, forwarded clips of television anchors dissecting the scandal. Some asked for my thoughts. Others congratulated me quietly as though I had orchestrated the downfall myself. But I said nothing. I didn't need to gloat. My silence was more powerful than any comment I could have made. By refusing to join the chorus, I preserved something they had long denied me: dignity. Late at night, I would sit with Daniel reading through the latest updates. He would glance at me, searching for signs of pain, but instead, he saw only calm. "You don't feel sorry for them at all?" he asked once. I shook my head slowly. "They made their choice long ago. This isn't my doing. It's just the truth finally catching up." And it was true. For years I had been painted as the disgrace, the failure, the daughter unworthy of pride. Now the roles had reversed without me lifting a finger. The golden child had revealed herself as tarnished, and the parents who had worshipped her were left exposed, their judgment dismantled in the eyes of the very community they had tried to impress. There was a strange peace in watching it all happen, a sense that the universe had balanced the scales. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to remind anyone of the years I had been overlooked. The world was doing it for me. And in that silence, I felt a satisfaction deeper than triumph. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about justice, pure and undeniable. As the scandal deepened and the family name crumbled, I stood apart, untouched my life, moving forward with strength and dignity. For the first time I realized that their downfall was not my victory, it was their own reckoning. And it was far more powerful than anything I could have planned. The scandal around Allison was still unraveling in headlines when Daniel decided it was time to shift the narrative fully into our hands. At the reception after the speeches and the toasts, the room quieted as he rose from his seat, champagne glass in hand. The spotlight found him easily, but instead of deflecting it as he often did, he embraced it, his voice steady and confident as he addressed the crowd. He began by thanking the guests for being there, for sharing in a night that was not just about love, but about building something larger than ourselves. Then, with a pause that seemed to stretch across the marble hall, he turned to me and took my hand, lifting it gently, as though to present me to the world. "For years," he said, "Rebecca has been underestimated, overlooked, and silenced. Tonight, that ends. From this day forward, she will stand beside me not only as my wife, but as my equal partner in leading the Collins Global Foundation. Every decision, every initiative, every outreach project will carry her name as much as mine." The room erupted into applause, the kind that rolled like thunder, filling the space with approval. I caught sight of a well-known senator rising to his feet, clapping with genuine enthusiasm, his expression one of respect rather than mere politeness. Other guests followed until the entire room was standing, their faces turned toward me, not with curiosity, but with admiration. The moment was overwhelming, a tide of recognition that swept away years of invisibility in my family's shadow. Reporters who had been lingering at the edges scribbled notes furiously, cameras flashing as they captured my expression. Later, those images would appear on front pages, me standing with Daniel, our hands linked, my eyes bright, not with tears but with pride. Headlines framed me as the woman who had gone from disgrace to dignified leader, a symbol of resilience and reinvention. Where Allison's name had once been praised, now mine rose in its place, her scandal a stark contrast to the honor Daniel had just bestowed upon me. The coverage was relentless, but this time it carried a warmth I had never experienced. Articles praised not only Daniel's empire, but his choice in a partner, noting how rare it was for someone in his position to speak so openly of equality in leadership. Analysts dissected the significance of his announcement, calling it a progressive move that would inspire other power couples. But the most meaningful pieces were the ones that focused on me, my story, my strength, the way I had carried myself through adversity with quiet dignity. Social media amplified it all. Hashtags that once swirled around scandal now celebrated my name, women posting about how my journey gave them courage to reclaim their own worth. Strangers I would never meet wrote about how seeing me rise despite rejection reminded them that life could still surprise them, that justice could still be found. For an audience that had once been fed a single narrative about my supposed failures, the reversal was intoxicating. Then, in the midst of the flurry, came a message that made the room buzz louder than before. A Hollywood actress beloved across generations for her grace and activism posted a photo of me in my wedding gown lifted from the broadcast. Beneath it, she wrote, "Strength looks like this. Grace looks like this. Congratulations, Rebecca. The world needs more women like you." The post went viral instantly, retweeted thousands of times, picked up by news outlets, and read aloud by anchors who couldn't resist the weight her words carried. When Daniel showed me the post on his phone, I laughed softly, shaking my head in disbelief. "She doesn't even know me," I said. "She doesn't need to," he replied. "She sees you." And so does everyone else now. Standing there with him, the noise of the party swirling around us, I felt a profound calm settle over me. For so long I had defined myself against the cruelty of my family, measuring my worth in the space between their disdain and my own quiet resilience. But in that moment, I wasn't just surviving their rejection, I was surpassing it. The recognition, the applause, the headlines, even the admiration from a woman I had once only seen on a movie screen, all of it confirmed what I had come to understand deep down. I was more than the role they had forced upon me. I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to confront them or list their sins. My life was speaking for me now, louder and clearer than anything I could have said. The golden child's crown had slipped, her empire exposed as hollow, while I stood crowned with something far stronger: respect. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about transformation. And in the glow of that night, with Daniel's hand warm in mine and the world finally watching with open eyes, I knew that my story was no longer theirs to twist. It was mine, and it had only just begun. The applause from Daniel's announcement was still echoing in my heart when another twist I could never have anticipated began to unfold. It came quietly, almost understated, with the arrival of an older gentleman at the reception. He was dressed in a simple but elegant suit, his gray hair neatly combed, his eyes kind but sharp, the kind of man who carried history in his posture. He introduced himself as Mr. Harris, the longtime attorney of my late grandfather. I remembered him faintly from my childhood, a face I had seen at family gatherings but never spoken to directly. When he asked for a moment of my time, I felt a shiver of curiosity. We stepped into a quieter part of the estate where the ocean breeze cut through the warm night. Mr. Harris held a leather folder under his arm, worn from years of use. "Rebecca," he said, his voice steady, "I've been waiting for the right moment to speak with you. Your grandfather left behind something that was always meant for you, but it was kept from you." My breath caught. Kept from me. He nodded gravely. "Your parents never told you the truth about his will." He opened the folder and pulled out documents yellowed with age but meticulously preserved. As he laid them out, I saw my name written again and again in bold letters in clauses and signatures. My grandfather had left me the bulk of his estate, several properties including the family's lake house I had always loved, and a significant portion of shares in a company he had built from the ground up. It was more than money, it was legacy. The tangible proof that he had believed in me, cherished me, entrusted me with what he valued most. The revelation hit me like a storm. All those years of being told I was nothing, that Allison was the true heir to the family pride, had been built on a lie. My parents had hidden this from me, twisting the truth to elevate her while keeping me in the shadows. While they paraded her as the golden child, they were sitting on what rightfully belonged to me, stealing not only assets, but the acknowledgement of love that should have been mine. Mr. Harris explained how he had tried to honor my grandfather's wishes, but my parents, through manipulation and intimidation, had shut him out. They had painted me as estranged, unworthy, claiming I had no interest in family legacy. For years he had carried the burden of that secret, waiting for the right time to step forward. And tonight, seeing me stand tall, respected, and celebrated, he knew the time had come. When the documents were notarized and the transfer formalized, I became the rightful heir, the legal owner of property and shares that my parents had enjoyed but never deserved. The news did not stay quiet for long. Within days, it reached the public, layered onto the crumbling narrative of my family's reputation. Reporters who had been covering Allison's scandal now had another angle. Not only had the Golden Sister squandered donations, but my parents had actively robbed their other daughter of her inheritance. The community's outrage deepened. Friends of my grandfather came forward furious at the betrayal of his wishes. The man had been respected, admired for his hard work and generosity. To learn that his legacy had been twisted and stolen struck a chord of indignation that spread like fire. And in the center of it all, I stood not as a victim, but as the rightful heir, finally acknowledged in the way my grandfather had always intended. Later that evening, still reeling from the revelation, I met another guest who introduced himself as an old friend of my grandfather. His eyes softened as he spoke of the man I had adored as a child. "He loved you deeply, Rebecca," he said. "He always told me you had a spirit like his, quiet strength, unshakable in storms. He wanted the world for you, and he would be proud to see you now." Those words pierced deeper than any headline or legal document. They carried the validation I had longed for my entire life, the whisper of a voice I still missed, reminding me that I had been seen, loved, and chosen all along. For years I had felt invisible, erased by the favoritism that crowned my sister and silenced me. But here was proof, not only in ink, but in memory, that my grandfather had recognized me as worthy. As I returned to the party, the music rising, Daniel's hand slipping into mine, I felt a sense of grounding I had never known before. Wealth and property were one thing, but the knowledge that I had been chosen, that I had mattered to him, was priceless. My parents had stolen years of recognition from me, but they could not steal the truth that had finally come to light. And now, with the world watching their empire crumble, while mine rose in its rightful place, I understood something profound. The real inheritance wasn't the land or the shares. It was the validation of love, the proof that I had always been enough. That more than anything was the victory they could never take from me. The cafe was quiet except for the low hum of conversations and the faint clinking of cups. Across from me sat my parents and Allison, their postures stiff, their eyes darting around as though afraid someone might notice them there. In truth, people already had. A few curious stares lingered, and I knew the whispers would spread long after this meeting ended. But I wasn't here to protect their image. For the first time in my life, I was here to strip away every illusion they had carefully built. I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm, and began. "Do you remember my 8th birthday?" My mother shifted her lips, pressing into a thin line. "You screamed at me in front of all my friends because the cake collapsed. You said even then I couldn't do anything right. Do you remember how I cried in my room while Allison opened presents in front of everyone, the guests pretending not to notice I wasn't there?" Silence hung heavy, their faces betraying the faintest flicker of guilt. I didn't stop. "What about prom? You bought Allison a gown worth thousands, but when I asked for a dress, you told me it was a waste of money. I went in a borrowed dress that didn't fit, and you laughed when people whispered about it. Or when you hosted dinners with extended family, and I was told to stay upstairs because I didn't represent the family well enough. Do you know what it's like to listen to laughter through the floorboards while your sister was introduced as your pride and joy?" My father finally opened his mouth, but I cut him off before he could form a word. "And let's not pretend this is about small slights. You didn't just humiliate me in childhood, you stole from me as an adult. You hid my grandfather's will, lied to me, took what was mine and let me live believing I was unwanted. All the while you raised Allison up as your golden child, showering her with every ounce of affection you denied me. But what did she do with it? She drained a charity of funds, paraded herself as generous while lining her pockets, and dragged your name through the mud. That was your pride. That was your legacy." Allison's cheeks flushed crimson. She started to speak, her voice rising with the same indignation that had filled her ranting video, but the words fell flat. There was no audience here to cheer her on, no parents rushing to defend her. Only the weight of her scandals, the evidence undeniable and public, pressed down on her shoulders. I looked each of them in the eye, steady, unflinching. "You called me a disgrace. You tore up my wedding invitation. You laughed at the man I love. You told everyone I would never amount to anything. And now the world has seen you for who you truly are. Liars, thieves, hypocrites. You built your empire on favoritism and cruelty, and you thought it would last forever. But here we are, and I don't have to raise my voice because the truth speaks louder than anything I could ever say." The weight of my words filled the space, and for once they had nothing to throw back at me. My father stared at his hands. My mother's eyes glistened, though she quickly blinked the tears away, and Allison sat stiff. Her jaw clenched as though silence was the only shield left to her. The cafe's atmosphere had shifted. Even those who had not been listening before now leaned in slightly, sensing the tension, the justice being served in real time. I sat back, my expression calm, my tone measured. There was no need to shout. Their bowed heads, their silence, their inability to deny the truth was louder than any confrontation could have been. For once, the power was mine, not because I had seized it with fury, but because they had relinquished it by drowning in their own lies. The satisfaction I felt was not wild or vengeful. It was quiet, steady, like the closing of a door that had been left ajar for too many years. They could no longer twist the story, no longer cast me as the failure, no longer pretend that their golden daughter shone brighter than me. The world had seen, and they had heard it from my lips. I rose from my seat, leaving them in their silence, their shame pressing down heavier than any scolding ever could. For once I was the one walking away with my head high, their silence echoing behind me like the sound of justice finally served. The confrontation at the cafe had left my parents and Allison silent, their eyes cast down as though the weight of their own sins had finally caught up with them. But as I walked away that day, I knew there was still one thing left undone. Silence had its power, but words, clear, undeniable words, would sever the last thread that bound me to them. Fate gave me that chance sooner than I expected. A family gathering had been arranged not by me, but by relatives who still clung to the illusion that reconciliation was possible. They invited me, perhaps thinking that the wounds could be mended with apologies whispered behind closed doors. I agreed to attend not out of hope, but out of certainty. I was ready to end it on my own terms. The room was filled with familiar faces, uncles, aunts, cousins, many of whom had watched my life from the sidelines, some complicit in their silence, others quietly sympathetic, but powerless. My parents and Allison were there, too pale and subdued, as if the scandals of the past months had drained them of the arrogance they once wore like armor. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, almost predictably, my father cleared his throat, trying to reclaim his old authority. "Rebecca," he began, his voice thin. "We've made mistakes, but we're still your family." I let the silence hang before I answered. When I finally spoke, my voice carried steady and strong across the room. "No. You are not my family. Not anymore. I have no parents anymore." The words dropped like a stone into water, sending ripples of shock across the gathering. Some gasped, others exchanged wide-eyed glances. My mother's hand flew to her chest as if the declaration had pierced her. Allison's lips parted, but no defense came. They all knew the truth. Every story I had revealed, every scandal that had broken, had built to this moment. What none of us realized in that instant was that a journalist invited discreetly by a distant cousin was present in the room. They had come expecting perhaps a story of fragile reconciliation. Instead, they witnessed a definitive severing. The reporter's small recorder captured my words with perfect clarity, words that would soon escape the confines of that room and echo across the nation. By the next morning, the headline was "Everywhere Bride Who Was Called a Disgrace Declares I Have No Parents Anymore." The article laid out the years of favoritism, the hidden will, the charity scandal, the public humiliation. It painted me not as cruel, but as courageous, a woman strong enough to cut ties with those who had diminished her for decades. The story spread quickly, carried by the same social media currents that had once mocked me, but now celebrated my resolve. Comments poured in beneath every post. "She's right. Family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by love. She stood her ground with dignity after everything they did. Good for her. That's strength most of us can only dream of." For every sympathetic word aimed at me, there was a scathing judgment aimed at my parents and Allison. They had wanted to control the narrative for so long, but now they were helpless as the world turned against them, calling out their hypocrisy and cruelty. When I read the coverage, I felt no regret. I hadn't spoken in anger. I hadn't shouted. I had spoken the truth, and the truth had resonated in ways I couldn't have orchestrated if I tried. The words that had been hidden in my heart for years were now public, undeniable, and final. At the next social event Daniel and I attended, I noticed the shift immediately. People approached me not with pity, but with admiration. They saw not a broken daughter, but a woman who had chosen dignity over toxic loyalty. Strangers wrote letters thanking me for giving them courage to step away from their own painful family ties. Women older than me, some who had lived their whole lives trying to please parents who never valued them, wrote that my words gave them permission to finally let go. That was the power of truth spoken plainly. It freed not only me but others who recognized themselves in my story. As for my parents and Allison, their faces no longer appeared in smiling social posts or polished community events. They avoided public gatherings, knowing the stares and whispers would follow them. The family who had once cast me out to preserve their pride now lived in the shadow of my declaration. They had lost control of me, of the narrative, and of the respect they had always craved. I remember leaving that family gathering with Daniel's arm around me. My parents sat frozen, their expressions etched with disbelief and regret, but I didn't look back. I stepped out into the evening air with a calm that was almost unfamiliar, a smile tugging at my lips. It wasn't the giddy triumph of revenge, it was something quieter, deeper. It was peace, the peace of knowing that I had ended the story on my own terms. Walking away that night, I realized that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is not anger, not revenge, but the simple act of saying enough. And as I left them in their silence, their empire of lies collapsing behind me, I carried with me the truth that had set me free. The words I had spoken, "I have no parents anymore," still lingered in headlines. But as the dust settled, my life began to reshape itself into something new. Something I had never dared to imagine when I was the overlooked daughter sitting silently in the shadows of my family. With the chapter of pain and betrayal firmly closed, I embraced the life that had unfolded before me. Daniel and I settled into married life, though. Settled feels too quiet a word for what it truly was. We traveled together not for display but for discovery, walking along quiet beaches in the early morning, slipping into small cafes in cities where no one recognized us, laughing freely without the weight of expectation pressing down on my shoulders. At home, I poured my energy into the Collins Global Foundation, the very organization Daniel had entrusted me to co-lead. For the first time, my work was not about survival or proving my worth to people who had dismissed me. It was about impact, about directing resources to places where they mattered most. I helped launch scholarship programs for girls who had been told they weren't enough, for women who had been silenced by families or communities that failed to see their value. Every signature I placed on a document, every speech I gave at a fundraiser, felt like an echo of my own story being transformed into hope for someone else. It wasn't long before the world began to take notice. One morning, as I sat with a cup of coffee overlooking the ocean, I received a call from a producer of one of the most iconic talk shows in the country. They wanted me to appear not just as Daniel's wife, but as Rebecca Collins, the woman who had endured public humiliation, familial betrayal, and still risen to claim her place with grace and strength. When I stepped onto that stage weeks later, greeted by applause that swelled through the studio, I felt the weight of my journey settle over me like a mantle. The host asked about my childhood, about the cruelty I had endured, about the moment I finally said enough. And I answered with honesty, not bitterness, not self-pity, but with the steady conviction of someone who had lived through fire and come out tempered, not burned. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in, women from every corner of the country writing to tell me how my story mirrored theirs. A grandmother from Texas who had spent her whole life trying to please parents who never cared, finally cutting ties at 70. A young woman from Ohio who found the courage to leave a toxic relationship after watching my interview. Even men wrote in confessing they had judged daughters or sisters unfairly and vowing to change. My story was no longer just mine, it had become a mirror in which others saw their own pain and their own possibility of freedom. Journalists who once wrote about scandals now wrote about resilience. Articles celebrated me as a model of perseverance, someone who had not only endured, but thrived. Headlines described me as the woman who turned disgrace into dignity and a symbol of strength for a generation taught to stay silent. Social media brimmed with tributes posts tagging me with words like courage and inspiration. Women shared pictures of themselves in moments of triumph using my story as a rallying cry. I became not just a name, but a symbol of the power of breaking free from chains, whether those chains were forged by family, society, or self-doubt. And yet, in the quiet moments away from the cameras and the applause, I often thought back to the girl I once was. The girl who sat at her birthday party humiliated while her sister basked in gifts. The girl who wore a borrowed dress to prom and listened to laughter from upstairs rooms where she was not welcome. That girl had cried into her pillow, convinced she would never be enough. I thought of her often not with sorrow, but with gratitude, because she had survived, because she had endured long enough to become the woman standing on stages, signing scholarship checks, smiling at strangers who looked at her with admiration instead of disdain. One evening, Daniel and I sat together on the balcony of our home, the sun setting in a blaze of colors across the horizon. He raised his glass to me, his eyes filled with the kind of pride that had once been withheld so cruelly by those who should have given it freely. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" he asked softly. I nodded, my gaze lingering on the horizon. Every day. And every day I realized the past doesn't define me anymore. It shaped me, yes, but it doesn't own me. I do. In that moment, I knew my story was no longer about revenge. Revenge had been the spark, the justice I had long deserved. But what followed was bigger, richer, and more lasting. It was about transformation. It was about becoming the woman I was always meant to be, no longer hidden, no longer silenced, but standing in the fullness of my strength. As I leaned back against Daniel, listening to the ocean below, I realized that my new life was not just about happiness. It was about meaning. It was about showing the world and reminding myself that no matter how deep the wounds of the past, healing and triumph were always possible. I was no longer the girl my parents had called a disgrace. I was Rebecca Collins, wife, leader, survivor, and inspiration. And my journey was far from over. In the weeks that followed my talk show appearance, my days filled with purpose and joy. I woke each morning beside Daniel, my heart lighter than it had ever been, my time devoted to building the foundation that bore my name. The world celebrated me now, but even in the applause I carried a quiet strength, a steadiness that came from knowing who I was and what I had overcome. And just when I thought the shadows of my past had finally retreated, they crept back in the form of letters, handwritten, desperate, and dripping with regret. The first envelope came in the mail, addressed in my mother's looping script. I recognized it instantly, though it had been years since I had seen her handwriting. My fingers hesitated over the seal, but curiosity won. Inside, the words pleaded for understanding. She wrote of sleepless nights of shame that followed her through grocery store aisles and church pews. She begged me to forgive her, to remember that she was still my mother. There was even a line about how families make mistakes, as if decades of cruelty and betrayal could be reduced to missteps in judgment. Soon after, another letter arrived, this time from my father. His words were less tender, more practical, but beneath them I sensed fear. He admitted their finances were crumbling, investments lost, allies gone, debts mounting. He confessed that the scandals had stripped them of their standing and that creditors were circling. "We need your help," he wrote, the ink smudged as though his hand had shaken. "You're the only one who can save us." As if to complete the chorus of desperation, Allison added her own voice. Her letter was shorter, angrier in tone, though even her arrogance could not disguise the desperation bleeding through the page. She wrote of being ostracized by friends, of doors closing in her face, of invitations rescinded. "You don't understand what it's like to be hated," she snapped, blind to the irony of her words. "But you could fix this for me. For us." Each letter in its own way begged me to reopen the door I had firmly shut. They tried different tones, pleading, practical, demanding, but all carried the same message: they were drowning, and they wanted me to throw them a lifeline. I read them all, and when I was done, I placed them neatly back into their envelopes and tucked them into a drawer. And then I did nothing. I did not respond, not with anger, not with comfort, not with even a single word. Silence was my answer, and it was louder than any letter I could have written in return. In my quiet refusal, I found strength. For years I had begged for scraps of love from them, begged to be seen, to be valued. Now they were the ones begging, and I was the one with the power to deny. It was not cruelty that guided me, it was clarity. They had shown me time and again who they were. To answer would only reopen wounds I had finally healed. Silence protected me, and in that silence I felt a peace that forgiveness could never have given me. But silence does not always remain private. One evening I received a call from a cousin I had always been fond of, one who had quietly supported me during the darker years. His voice trembled with a mixture of guilt and excitement. "Rebecca," he said, "I need to tell you something. Your parents' letters, they're not just with you anymore." He explained that another relative, bitter about the way my parents had treated me, had taken copies of the letters and posted them online. Within hours, the letters spread across social media, their words dissected, mocked, and shared thousands of times. Screenshots filled feeds with commentary that left no room for sympathy. People ridiculed my mother's plea for forgiveness, pointing out the hypocrisy in her attempt to soften decades of abuse. They scoffed at my father's confession, branding him not a man seeking redemption, but a coward scrambling to save himself. And Allison's bitter demands became the butt of endless jokes, her arrogance exposed for the world to see. The chorus of public judgment was merciless, and for once it wasn't directed at me. The community that had once whispered about me behind closed doors now shouted its condemnation at them. They had a diamond and treated her like dirt, one comment read. Now they want her to clean up their mess. Unbelievable. Another wrote, "Rebecca's silence is the loudest response possible. They don't deserve even a word." I watched it all unfold without comment, sipping tea on my balcony as the tide of ridicule washed over them. My silence had been enough to sever ties, but now the world joined in amplifying the rejection they had so long deserved. I felt no guilt, no burden to protect them from the consequences of their own choices. They had sown their cruelty, and now they reaped humiliation. That night, as Daniel wrapped an arm around me and whispered, "You don't need to carry them anymore," I realized he was right. The letters were nothing more than echoes of a past I had already buried. Their pleas did not move me, their suffering did not weaken me. If anything, it reinforced the truth I had always known, but never spoken aloud. I had been stronger than them all along. And as their words circulated in the digital world, mocked by strangers and condemned by neighbors, I knew my silence had become its own kind of justice. Not only for me, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or discarded by those meant to love them. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not a sharp retort or a public rebuke. Sometimes it is the stillness of a closed door, and the certainty that it will never again be opened. The letters had stopped coming, but their silence was no longer a weapon against me. It was a cage they now lived inside, one I had built not out of spite, but out of resolve. I left their pleas unanswered, and the world had answered for me. That chapter was finished, and I felt no need to revisit it. One evening, as the Pacific waves crashed softly against the cliffs of Malibu, I sat on the wide balcony of our estate with a glass of champagne in hand. The night air was cool, scented faintly with salt and jasmine, and the horizon was painted in dusky hues of orange and deepening blue. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, a reminder of freedom, of possibility, of how far I had come. The chair beneath me was comfortable, the kind that allowed you to sink in and simply breathe. I leaned back, letting the breeze tangle in my hair, and for the first time in years, there was no trace of tension in my shoulders. The house behind me, glowing softly with warm lights, stood as a monument to resilience. This was my home now, not just because of its grandeur, but because it was filled with love, laughter, and respect, things I had once thought were luxuries beyond my reach. I raised the glass and let the bubbles dance on my tongue, savoring not just the taste, but the symbolism of it. Once my parents had mocked me for dreaming too big, for thinking I was worthy of a life beyond their control. They had shredded my invitation. They had sneered at my fiancé. They had buried my grandfather's love and legacy in lies. And now here I was, seated on a balcony worth more than their entire fabricated pride, enjoying the quiet knowledge that I had won not through cruelty, not through shouting, but through becoming untouchable in my own grace. As I watched the waves, I thought back on the journey piece by painful piece. The little girl who cried over a collapsed birthday cake. The teenager who wore a borrowed dress while her sister twirled in satin. The young woman whose fiancé was called worthless, whose wedding invitation was torn and tossed in the trash. And then the woman who stood in Malibu, broadcast to millions, celebrated and embraced by a world that once doubted her. Every wound had shaped me, but none had destroyed me. In truth, they had only sharpened my edges. It was tempting to imagine a grand finale of confrontation, a speech that would echo through the years and leave my family in ruins. But I realized now that I didn't need words to finish this story. My silence had been enough. When they begged for forgiveness, I gave them none. When they asked for help, I gave them none. I had simply turned away, and the world had seen the strength in that choice. My silence was not emptiness, it was authority. It was a final judgment they could not escape or twist. I smiled faintly as the wind carried the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs, a rhythm older than any grudge, steadier than any scandal. I had learned the truth the hard way, but I carried it with me now like a shield. Sometimes silence is the loudest revenge. It was not the absence of action, but the presence of power, the ability to walk away and let the guilty unravel in their own guilt. Behind me, I heard Daniel's voice calling softly, asking if I was ready to join him inside. I turned my head, meeting his gaze through the open glass doors, and my smile widened. This was my life now, not defined by their disdain, not limited by their lies, but built on strength, love, and the quiet certainty that I had survived everything meant to break me. I took one last sip of champagne and set the glass down on the railing, my eyes never leaving the horizon. The ocean roared its endless song, and I listened, knowing it mirrored my own. My journey had begun in pain, but it ended here in victory, not loud and brash, but quiet and unshakable. And in that quiet, I found everything I had ever wanted. Sometimes silence is the loudest revenge. The memory of that evening on the balcony, the champagne in my hand, and the ocean stretching wide and endless still lingered in my mind when a new invitation arrived. It wasn't a wedding invitation or a family letter begging for forgiveness. It was an invitation to speak at one of the largest charity events in the country, an annual gala that brought together philanthropists, community leaders, and ordinary people eager to make a difference. They didn't just want me to attend. They wanted me to deliver the keynote address, to share my story as a testament to strength, survival, and the power of using pain as fuel for change. The night of the event, the hall shimmered with light. Crystal chandeliers glowed above rows of round tables draped in white linen. Hundreds of people filled the room, their voices a steady hum of anticipation. As I walked onto the stage, a hush fell, and then came a wave of applause that rose and swelled until it filled the entire space. The sound wrapped around me not like the shallow praise I had once watched my sister receive, but like genuine recognition born from respect. I stood at the podium, my hands steady, my voice calm, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel small or overlooked. I felt whole. I spoke about my journey, though not with bitterness or anger. I told them of the obstacles, of the cruelty of being dismissed, of the years when I believed I had no worth. And then I told them how I had found my voice, how I had chosen to rise rather than sink, how silence had become my strength. The words came easily, each one carrying the weight of lived experience, each one meant for the women in the audience who had known the same sting of neglect, the same hunger for validation. When I finished, the room rose to its feet. The standing ovation seemed to go on forever, people clapping, some even wiping tears, as if they had been waiting for someone to put their unspoken truths into words. The next morning, a major newspaper published a feature on me. The headline read, "From Disgrace to Dignity, Rebecca Collins and the Power of Rising Above." The article traced my story from the humiliation of childhood to the triumph of the Malibu wedding and beyond to the work I was now doing through the foundation. But what struck me most was not the retelling of events. It was the way the writer described me. They called me a symbol for women who had been silenced, a figure who had shown that the cruelest voices in our lives don't define us. The piece was shared thousands of times across social media, often with captions like, "If she can do it, so can we," or "This is the story I needed today." Messages poured in once again, this time from women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, women who had carried their pain quietly for decades. Women who wrote that my story gave them courage to finally speak, to finally step into their own strength. They told me they saw themselves in me and that my victory felt like theirs too. I read those words late into the night, tears slipping down my cheeks. Not of sadness, but of recognition. I had become the voice I once longed to hear. One evening after the whirlwind of interviews and events, I found myself alone again on the balcony of Malibu Estate, the waves rolling steady below. I thought of the girl I used to be, the child at the birthday table, the teenager in the borrowed dress, the woman who cried when her wedding invitation was torn. I wanted to reach back through time to take her hand and whisper, "Hold on. You will not only survive this, you will thrive." And though I couldn't go back, I felt as though in some way I had kept that promise to her. I smiled into the night air, the ocean breeze cool against my skin. For years I had chased their approval, begged for scraps of love that never came. Now I understood that I had never needed it. The validation I longed for was already inside me, waiting for me to claim it. I had built a life not on their acceptance, but on my own resilience. As I stood there listening to the steady rhythm of the waves, I felt no bitterness, no lingering anger, only peace. My journey had been painful, but it had led me here to a life filled with love, respect, and purpose. And in that peace, I found my final victory. I had not only defeated the voices that tried to diminish me, I had discovered the truest voice of all my own,